Hello and welcome to On Thin Ice, the show where I, your penguin host, must apparently travel to some of the most uncomfortable and inhospitable places imaginable in order to bring you content. I mean, I know Antarctica's a frozen wasteland, but at least it's my frozen wasteland, you know? There's not even any ice to speak of here anyways, much less ice that can be described as thin. All this to say, this week's installment has swept me away to the deserts of the lonely American Southwest. And though my flippers are most definitely on foreign soil, they're still firmly planted on the ground. The reason why I've come here is simply to offer an interesting backdrop for today's topic, which is equal parts incredible and horrifying. I speak, of course, of what I consider to be author Cormac McCarthy's crowning literary achievement and one of the greatest pieces of American historical fiction, Blood Meridian. Before I begin that, though, I must issue some warnings. First, the spoiler warning. I'll be discussing the book in depth, and if you have not read the book already, I highly encourage you to do so before watching this week's episode. Second, I'd be remiss to not include a content warning. Blood Meridian deals with very graphic and uncomfortable subjects, such as genocide, intense racism, abuse, and countless other unsavory and disturbing things. Viewer and reader discretion is advised. For those of you who I've managed to not scare away, sit by the fire with me a while, as I discuss the grandeur and the atrocities of Blood Meridian. Before we wade through the blood and the bones, I think it's prudent to point out that Blood Meridian is a difficult novel to understand. There are several keys to improving your understanding of it. First, you have to be familiar with the history behind the book's narrative. Second, you have to be familiar with McCarthy's influences and writing style. Third, and finally, you must have a grasp of certain classical literary texts. Taking these precautions will ensure that the book's intended impact sticks the landing in your mind's eye, and that your reading experience will be holistic and complete. Let's talk history. The driving narrative of Blood Meridian follows the travels of a main character. I refrain from using the word protagonist for reasons that will be discussed later, known only as the Kid, who is a teenage boy, and his experiences with the gang of John Joel Glanton. Glanton and his band of ruffians actually did exist. In fact, primary sources from a contemporary by the name of Samuel Chamberlain gives the Glanton gang a geographical place and time in history. In this case, the early to mid-19th century in Texas, Arizona, and parts of Mexico. It was during this time that the Mexican-American Wars were fought, and even though the conflict had ended in 1848, Glanton and his gang still had a thirst for blood, and were awarded a contract by the Mexican government to hunt and kill native Mexicans. This was, by no stretch of the imagination, a truly lawless collection of men whose acts of unbridled and indiscriminate violence defy belief and toe the line between reality and myth. While there are certainly some people who were gang members and have had their names recorded as such, any and all participants in this shrewd group of men pale in comparison to one particular man, known simply as Judge Holden. Not much is known about the real-life Judge Holden, but man oh man are you gonna learn about the fictional version of him, and to be quite frank with you, most of you will wish you hadn't. Now that I've given the book a proper historical backdrop, we move on to Cormac's very particular writing style, where there are a few things worthy of note. Firstly, the punctuation, or should I say, lack of it. The book is largely unadorned with quotation marks, and the vast majority of punctuation is limited to periods and, on occasion, commas. This is a decision consciously made by McCarthy that, in his opinion, doesn't mark up the pages in unnecessary ways. However, many people are put off by this decision, and in some cases it is one of the principal deterrents barring people from reading the book. Furthermore, the simplicity and dry frankness of the book's dialogue stands in stark contrast to the intimate and beautifully sprawling prose that paints a hauntingly wonderful picture of the setting and events, even in times of evil, which, by the way, crop up frequently. A full appreciation of Blood Meridian also involves some literary homework. The books that most helped me fully appreciate Blood Meridian were the King James Bible, John Milton's Paradise Lost, and Dante's Inferno. McCarthy's use of language is very biblical at times in Blood Meridian, especially when it comes to the dialogue of one specific character, and he even borrows certain literary techniques from the Bible. A good example is that of polysyndeton, or the use of the same conjunction over and over again in a text. So those run-on sentences you're thinking about pointing out, it's actually a deliberate creative choice made by Cormac. Much of the imagery is also biblically inspired. Many of the allegories and events that transpire during the course of Blood Meridian can also be traced to equivalent scenarios depicted in Milton's Paradise Lost. Finally, every book whose premise is constructed on concepts of sublime horror owes credit to one of the first books to ever describe the indescribable, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, Inferno in particular. There are, of course, other influences that we could list off, but for the sake of clarity, these are my personal top 3 that should be taken into consideration. With all the setup out of the way, there's just one more order of business. I must make clear what this video is not. I will not be doing a play-by-play retelling of the story, interjecting with my own commentary. I certainly could do that, and let me know if that's something you would like to see me do sometime in the future, but to be honest, it has already been done very well by others in the past. In particular, I found Wendigoon's 5-hour-long video about Blood Meridian to be as complete an analysis as anything else I've come across. A link to that video will be in the description. I highly recommend that you check it out if you have a spare couple of hours. My goal in this specific video is to simply communicate my take on some of the key messages from the book. There are moments that I'd like to discuss and offer my thoughts on, and finally, I want to share my thoughts on some of the main characters in the book. Again, I will not be using the word protagonist to describe these people, if they can even be called people. Ugh. And that might be the best place to start. The tone of the book. I can personally confirm that there is not a single good person in this entire book. Period. End of story. Not even the people with whose perspective the book is framed are good. Morally gray at best, but not good. The men in this story act only out of a self-motivated and self-destructive desire to commit evil acts and shed blood. It's this very lust that leads to their downfall and the dramatic end of the gang as a unit. That brings me to the first passage I would like to discuss. Before I share it though, some narrative context is necessary. As I mentioned earlier, the beginning of the book follows a young teenage boy as he runs away from home and gets mixed up with several bad crowds, until he eventually ends up in a town in Texas called Nacogdoches, among some expat Civil War vets under the command of a former U.S. Army sergeant. These men undertake the process of tracking down native Mexicans, such as Apaches and Comanches, in order to murder them and turn in their scalps for a bounty. Real uplifting, positive stuff. An honest living, to say the least. Anyways, and with all jokes aside, they end up tracking a party of natives for several days, and at some point, they set up camp. They thought they had the jump on the natives, which makes the following passage all the more shocking, as the natives actually flip the script and attack them first. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes attic or biblical or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers, or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque with daubings like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip jerks and drools. "Oh my God," said the sergeant. Now, I'm a very well-read penguin, and I've read some compelling prose in my time. Very few literary passages that I've read match the frenzy and terror represented by this scene. There's something about it that just sticks with me. I can only imagine being run down and slaughtered by such a ghoulish group of people. Truly horrifying stuff. Enough about the terror, though. Why did I include this passage in particular? War. That's why. Cormac McCarthy has a lot to say about war and its associations in Blood Meridian. One could even make the argument that the main character is, in fact, War, as opposed to any other human character in the book. Perhaps the term main character is a bit too reductive. Driving narrative force seems more fitting. This is not the only time McCarthy makes use of a driving narrative force in his work. The book and movie, No Country for Old Men, is driven forward by the destructive powers of a man known as Anton Chigurh, who has many similarities to the Judge in Blood Meridian. Chigurh, as he murderously rampages through the book, is the embodiment of cruel and indiscriminate chaos and violence. And the Judge, similarly, represents war. But that's not all he represents. I'll get to that later. For now, I'd like to formally introduce the character of the Judge to you with an excerpt. In order to not butcher the beautifully terrible way in which it is written, I'll be quoting it word for word. It reads, "Men are born for games. Nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows too that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have any meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake, because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trial of chance, or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war, for here that which is wagered swallows up game, player, all. Suppose two men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale? A turn of the card. The whole universe for such a player has labored clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is a preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance either one. In such games as have for their stake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man, holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand, is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game, because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. This quote bothers me. It bothers me a lot. It should bother you too. Allow me to explain why. The Judge, which is short for Judge Holden, is someone who travels with the company and seems to have an almost supernatural presence. He's described as being nearly 7 feet tall, completely hairless, and with pale skin that is likely the result of albinism. Despite his massive size and superhuman strength, we are told that many of his features are more akin to those of a child than of a man, with smooth skin and oddly proportioned hands. From the very start of the book, we are shown the seemingly infinite spite, malice, and calculated cruelty that fuels the Judge, as well as the nightmarish violence he is clearly capable of. He is incredibly smart, being able to speak several languages fluently. He flippantly quotes scripture and ancient poetry, almost regardless of circumstance. Once, when the gang was cornered by their native enemies and in dire need, he led them to an old volcano in the desert and made gunpowder from his own urine and lava rock to save their lives, in a scene straight from the pages of Paradise Lost. He obsessively catalogs any natural phenomena he comes to observe, not out of an innocent curiosity, mind you, but for a far more nefarious purpose. When asked about this practice, he coldly replies with the following statement: "Whatever exists in creation without my knowledge exists without my consent." Yikes. If that doesn't give you the chills, I really don't know what will. Oh, and did I mention that he is a master fiddler and dancer? Clearly a man of many talents. To bring this episode into its bell lap, I'd like to ask a simple rhetorical question. Who's the Judge? This is a question that has led to countless dissenting discourses on the matter. Here, I'll offer my humble opinion, as it is my belief that many of these character studies have missed the forest for the trees. That is to say, they've assumed that the answer must be complex and multifaceted when in reality his true identity is staring us in the face. To explain my view on this, I must first review the basic Christian beliefs concerning the spiritual existence that precedes mortality. In the Christian canon, all bodies have a spirit, and all spirits lived with God in a sort of premortal realm. God decreed that all spirits must come to earth, gain a body, experience mortality, and eventually die, at which point the spirits of the deceased would return again to the Father's presence. Two plans to accomplish this goal were proposed. First, an angel named Lucifer suggested that all of God's children would be forced to live their lives in a certain way, thus robbing them of their agency. His argument was that all spirits would be saved and be able to return to God having committed no sin. Additionally, since it was he who conceived of the plan, he demanded credit and honor for it. God rejected this plan in favor of the plan of another angel named Jehovah, who would eventually arrive on earth as Jesus Christ and die to redeem the fallen world. This caused a great and terrible war in heaven, which ended with the casting out of Lucifer and all the heavenly hosts who had decided to support him. The story doesn't end there, though. Eventually, God created the first man and woman, named Adam and Eve, and placed them in the Garden of Eden as caretakers. He gave them a few commandments, one of them being to not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Lucifer, who is now known as Satan, concealed himself as a serpent in his fallen state, and tricked them into eating the fruit, creating what is known in the Christian canon as the first transgression, or first act of rebellion against God. This resulted in the expulsion of Adam and Eve and their posterity, meaning the rest of humanity, from God's presence. The story doesn't end there either. Adam and Eve's first son, Cain, was tempted by Satan to kill his younger brother Abel, thus causing the first conspiracy to take the life of another. As a result of this crucial moment, man has been tempted to indulge in violence and bloodshed ever since. That's right. I think the judge is Satan, the devil of Christianity himself, the antagonist of mankind. His smooth appearance resembles that of a serpent, and he exhibits a mastery of most earthly things. It is a commonly held Christian belief that Satan's desire is to rule over the mortal earth, which would describe the judge's attitude towards cataloging the life that exists therein. Lucifer was the original warmongerer and champion of conflict in heaven, which justifies the judge's comments on war and God. Satan is a continuous source of conflict in the world, and wherever there is evil and bloodshed in Blood Meridian, the judge is always there. But the opposite is also true. See, once the Glanted gang eventually self-destructs due to their insatiable lust for violence, the judge manages to escape into the desert, and over time, he becomes the final surviving member of that gang, since he hunts down and kills the other survivors, including the kid. Great guy, huh? And what does he do next? He simply moves on, likely to find another degenerate group of vile men to rub shoulders with until their use also expires, at which point he moves on once again, and thus continues the never-ending cycle. To conclude, there is one more implication that I find concerning. If the judge leaves his mark all over the book, then where's God? Where's the hope? The redemption? This contributes to another aspect of the judge's character, as well as the world McCarthy constructed in Blood Meridian. The judge is not just the devil, but he is the devil unshackled. The godless world in which the story takes place serves as a vivid illustration of how the world's balance might shift in the absence of evil's antithesis. Unfettered by righteousness or fear of retribution or justice, evil is allowed to roam freely, consuming everything it touches. And what does that mean about Cormac McCarthy's view on life and religion? The honest answer is, we'll likely never know. McCarthy sadly passed away in 2023, and even while he was alive, it was difficult to get him to answer such questions. So, just like the ambiguous and somewhat hopeless ending of Blood Meridian, we, the readers, are left to pick up the tattered and bloody pieces ourselves, and reach our own conclusions. You've just heard mine, but honestly, most of you would likely have a different take. This book, as horrible as it is undeniably brilliant, and therefore comes highly recommended. What are your thoughts on Blood Meridian? What's your take on the book's true message? Who do you think the judge is? Will you ever get a full night of sleep again? Leave a comment down below. I look forward to reading them. If you managed to stick around this long, why not like and subscribe? It helps the channel out immensely. Finally, if you missed any of the last few episodes, here's some links. I'm Philip, this has been On Thin Ice, in the desert, and again, thank you for watching.